Number 1. John Geoghan. The case that exposed a systemic cover-up. John Geoghan was a Roman Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Boston whose decades-long pattern of sexually abusing children became the catalyst for one of the most consequential institutional scandals in modern religious history. Geoghan was ordained in 1962 and over the following 30 years was moved between numerous parishes in the Boston area, with church records later revealing that archdiocese officials, including Cardinal Bernard Law, were repeatedly informed of allegations against him yet continued to reassign him to new parishes with unsupervised access to children rather than removing him from ministry. More than 130 individuals eventually came forward alleging abuse by Geoghan spanning his entire career, with many describing a consistent pattern in which he targeted boys from large families, often from households facing financial or social difficulties, gaining the trust of parents before abusing the children entrusted to his care. The full scope of the cover-up became public starting in 2002, when the Boston Globe Spotlight investigative team published a series of articles based on previously sealed church documents that had been obtained through litigation brought by victims' attorneys. These documents demonstrated that archdiocese leadership had known about complaints against Geoghan for decades and had consistently prioritized protecting the institution's reputation over protecting children. The revelations triggered an avalanche of additional victims coming forward, not only regarding Geoghan but regarding numerous other priests across the archdiocese, and ultimately led to Cardinal Law's resignation in December 2002 amid intense public pressure. Geoghan himself was criminally prosecuted, convicted of indecent assault and battery in 2002, and sentenced to 9 to 10 years in prison. While incarcerated, he was murdered by a fellow inmate, Joseph Druce, in August 2003. The Archdiocese of Boston ultimately reached civil settlements with hundreds of victims totaling tens of millions of dollars, and the case is widely credited with breaking open the broader Catholic Church sexual abuse crisis that subsequently led to revelations and investigations across the United States and internationally, fundamentally changing public and institutional understanding of how religious organizations had systematically protected abusive clergy at the expense of victims for decades. Number 2. Jerry Sandusky. Though not clergy, a parallel case of institutional betrayal. While Jerry Sandusky was not a member of the clergy, his case is frequently discussed alongside religious institutional abuse scandals because of the strikingly similar pattern of institutional protection that allowed his crimes to continue for years, and it is included here to illustrate how the dynamics of institutional cover-up extend beyond religious organizations to any institution where adults are granted trusted, unsupervised access to children. Sandusky was a former assistant football coach at Penn State University who used his position and the charity he founded, The Second Mile, which was designed to support at-risk youth, to identify and groom victims over a period spanning decades. Multiple Penn State officials, including assistant coach Mike McQueary, witnessed or were informed of suspicious behavior over the years, and internal reporting up the university's chain of command failed to result in Sandusky's removal or a report to outside law enforcement that reflected the severity of what had been witnessed. The case became public in 2011 following a grand jury investigation, and the scandal resulted not only in Sandusky's prosecution but in the firing of legendary head coach Joe Paterno and university president Graham Spanier, reflecting the scale of institutional failure involved. Sandusky was convicted in 2012 on 45 counts of child sexual abuse and was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. The case prompted significant reforms in mandatory reporting requirements for educational institutions and is frequently cited in discussions of institutional abuse precisely because the pattern, adults in positions of trust exploiting access to vulnerable children while institutional leadership prioritized reputation over child safety, mirrors the dynamics documented extensively in clergy abuse cases within religious institutions. Number 3. Theodore McCarrick. A cardinal's fall from the highest ranks. Theodore McCarrick rose to become one of the most powerful figures in the American Catholic Church, serving as Archbishop of Washington and being elevated to cardinal in 2001, a position that placed him among the most senior clergy in the global church. For decades, rumors and some formal complaints had circulated regarding McCarrick's conduct toward seminarians and young priests under his authority, including allegations that he had used his position to coerce sexual contact from men who depended on his patronage for their advancement within the church. These allegations were known to varying degrees among some church officials for years but did not result in formal accountability measures, reflecting a broader pattern in which complaints against senior clergy were handled informally or not at all. The situation changed dramatically in 2018, when a new allegation emerged involving the sexual abuse of a minor decades earlier, prompting the Archdiocese of New York to investigate. The allegation was found credible, and Pope Francis removed McCarrick from public ministry in June 2018. Subsequent investigation revealed additional allegations spanning decades and involving both minors and adult seminarians. In February 2019, Pope Francis took the unprecedented step of formally defrocking McCarrick, removing him entirely from the priesthood, making him the highest-ranking Catholic Church official in modern history to be stripped of his clerical status due to sexual abuse allegations. The Vatican subsequently released a lengthy report in 2020 examining how McCarrick had risen through the church hierarchy despite known concerns about his conduct, a report that detailed failures of oversight at multiple levels of church governance, including decisions made by multiple popes. McCarrick was also criminally charged in Massachusetts in 2021 related to an alleged 1974 assault, though the criminal case was later dismissed after a court determined he was not competent to stand trial due to dementia. The case represented an extraordinary breach in the wall of institutional protection that had historically shielded senior clergy from accountability, demonstrating that even cardinals were not beyond the reach of consequences once sufficient evidence and institutional will existed to pursue them. Number 4. The Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report. Documenting decades of systemic abuse. In August 2018, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office released the findings of a multi-year grand jury investigation into child sexual abuse within 6 Catholic dioceses across the state, producing a report that documented allegations against more than 300 priests spanning a period of more than 70 years and identifying more than 1,000 identifiable victims, with investigators noting the actual number of victims was likely far higher given the difficulty many survivors face in coming forward. The report was notable not only for its scope but for its detailed documentation of the specific bureaucratic and administrative methods church officials used to manage and conceal abuse allegations, including internal church documents describing what investigators termed a playbook of techniques such as using euphemistic language in personnel files to obscure the nature of allegations, conducting only superficial internal investigations, quietly transferring accused priests to new parishes, without informing the new community of prior allegations, and in some cases providing financial settlements to victims in exchange for confidentiality agreements that prevented public disclosure. The grand jury report led to significant legal and legislative consequences in Pennsylvania, including reforms extending the statute of limitations for victims to bring civil claims related to childhood sexual abuse, though efforts to create a retroactive window for previously time-barred claims faced ongoing legal and political battles in the years following the report's release. The report also triggered renewed scrutiny of dioceses in other states, with several states subsequently launching their own attorney general investigations modeled on the Pennsylvania approach, and it remains one of the most comprehensive official government documentations of the systemic nature of clergy abuse and institutional cover-up within the Catholic Church in the United States. Number 5. Marcial Maciel Degollado. Founder of the Legion of Christ and a decades-long deception. Marcial Maciel Degollado founded the Legion of Christ, a conservative Catholic religious order, in Mexico in 1941, and built it over subsequent decades into an influential international organization with seminaries, schools, and a lay movement called Regnum Christi operating across multiple countries, cultivating relationships with senior Vatican officials and presenting himself publicly as a model of Orthodox Catholic devotion. Throughout this period, Maciel was sexually abusing seminarians and it was later revealed, fathering multiple children with different women while maintaining his public image of celibate religious devotion. Allegations against Maciel from former seminarians began surfacing publicly in the 1990s, but his powerful connections within the Vatican, including a close relationship with Pope John Paul II, who praised Maciel publicly on multiple occasions, meant that these allegations were not seriously investigated for years. It was not until 2006, under Pope Benedict XVI, that the Vatican took action, with the Vatican announcing that Maciel would be removed from public ministry and ordered to a restricted life of prayer and penance, though notably he was never criminally prosecuted or formally defrocked, and the Vatican's initial public statements did not explicitly acknowledge the abuse allegations. Maciel died in 2008. It was only after his death that the full scope of his deception became public, including confirmation that he had fathered at least 6 children across multiple relationships, using funds from the religious order to support these secret families, and that he had sexually abused numerous seminarians over a period spanning decades. The Legion of Christ itself commissioned an internal investigation that confirmed extensive abuse, and the order undertook a lengthy process of reform under Vatican oversight in the years following these revelations. The case is frequently cited as one of the most extreme examples of how a religious leader's public reputation and political connections within an institution can mask decades of profound abuse and deception, with the truth only fully emerging after the perpetrator's death made accountability through traditional disciplinary or criminal means impossible. Number 6. The Southern Baptist Convention Investigation. Abuse across a decentralized denomination. In May 2022, an independent investigative firm released a report commissioned by the Southern Baptist Convention's Executive Committee documenting how the denomination's leadership had, over a period of at least 2 decades, mishandled and in many cases actively suppressed reports of sexual abuse by pastors and other church leaders across its network of autonomous congregations. The report was particularly significant because the Southern Baptist Convention's decentralized structure, in which individual churches operate with substantial autonomy rather than under a centralized hierarchy similar to the Catholic Church, had previously been cited by denominational leaders as a reason the convention could not maintain a central database of known abusers or take centralized disciplinary action. The investigation found that despite this structural argument, key denominational leaders had in practice maintained an informal list of pastors credibly accused of abuse for years without taking action to warn congregations or law enforcement, and that survivors who came forward were frequently met with hostility, legal intimidation, or dismissal by denominational officials concerned about legal liability and reputational damage to the convention. The report detailed specific cases in which known abusers continued working in ministry positions, sometimes moving to new churches without their history being disclosed, mirroring patterns documented in Catholic Church cases despite the very different organizational structure. Following the report's release, the Southern Baptist Convention voted to establish a publicly accessible database of credibly accused individuals and created new mechanisms intended to improve reporting and accountability, though survivors' advocates have continued to raise concerns about the pace and adequacy of implementation. The case illustrated that the systemic patterns of institutional abuse and cover-up documented extensively within the Catholic Church were not unique to that denomination's particular hierarchical structure, but reflected broader institutional dynamics that can emerge within any large religious organization when reputational concerns are allowed to outweigh accountability to victims. Number 7. Tony Anthony. A Christian speaker's fabricated testimony and hidden abuse. Tony Anthony built a substantial career as an international Christian motivational speaker and author, presenting a dramatic personal testimony of having been a martial arts champion and bodyguard for celebrities before his conversion to Christianity, a story that formed the basis of best-selling books and numerous speaking engagements at churches and Christian events across multiple countries over more than a decade. In 2019, investigative journalism, including detailed reporting that examined his claimed credentials and personal history, revealed that significant portions of his public testimony had been fabricated, including claims about his martial arts achievements and security work that did not hold up to scrutiny. As this investigation unfolded, separate and more serious allegations emerged from women who had worked with or been associated with Anthony's ministry, alleging sexual misconduct and abuse of power within the organization he had built. The revelations led to the immediate collapse of Anthony's speaking career and the organizations associated with him, with churches and Christian organizations that had hosted him distancing themselves and, in some cases, publicly apologizing to congregations for having platformed him without adequate vetting. The case became a significant point of discussion within evangelical Christian communities regarding the lack of accountability structures for independent Christian speakers and ministries that operate outside traditional denominational oversight, raising questions about how easily a compelling personal narrative, even one built substantially on fabrication, could provide a platform from which abuse of power could occur with limited institutional checks, given that such independent ministries often lack the kind of formal oversight structures that, while demonstrably imperfect in cases like Geoghan's, at least theoretically exist within more traditional denominational structures. Number 8. Ravi Zacharias. A posthumous reckoning for an apologetic icon. Ravi Zacharias was among the most prominent Christian apologists of his generation, founder of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, and a figure whose books, lectures and media appearances reached enormous global audiences over a career spanning decades, with his organization presenting him as a model of Christian integrity and intellectual rigor. Zacharias died in May 2020, and in the months following his death, women who had worked at spas he owned came forward with allegations of sexual misconduct, prompting his ministry organization to commission an independent investigation. The investigation, released in February 2021, found extensive evidence that Zacharias had engaged in years of sexual abuse and exploitation of multiple women, using his position, his ownership of massage businesses, and his standing within the organization he led to manipulate and coerce victims, while simultaneously threatening legal action against individuals who had previously attempted to raise concerns about his conduct during his lifetime. The investigation found that Zacharias's inner circle had enabled this behavior for years, with some staff members aware of red flags that were not adequately investigated or escalated. Following the release of the investigation's findings, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries announced it would cease operations, and numerous institutions that had honored Zacharias, including academic institutions that had named programs or buildings after him, moved to remove his name and disassociate from his legacy. The case became a significant example within evangelical Christian circles of how a public reputation for moral authority and intellectual integrity could mask predatory behavior for years, with accountability only emerging after death when victims who had been silenced or disbelieved during his lifetime were finally able to come forward without fear of his direct retaliation, prompting broader conversations within Christian institutions about the dangers of insufficient accountability. Structures for celebrity religious leaders. Number 9. Jean Vanier, the founder of L'Archi and a Hidden History of Manipulation. Jean Vanier founded L'Archi, an international network of communities where people with and without intellectual disabilities live together, in France in 1964, building an organization widely admired for its innovative and compassionate approach to disability and community, with Vanier himself regarded during his lifetime as a spiritual figure of profound moral authority, sometimes discussed as a candidate for sainthood within Catholic circles. Vanier died in 2019. In 2020, L'Archi International released the findings of an investigation it had commissioned after receiving allegations against Vanier, finding credible evidence that Vanier had engaged in manipulative and emotionally abusive sexual relationships with at least 6 adult women without disabilities over a period spanning from the 1970s into the 2000s, using spiritual and psychological manipulation techniques connected to his standing as a spiritual mentor to coerce these relationships, which he reportedly framed to victims in mystical religious terms that made the abuse difficult for victims to name or resist at the time. A further, more extensive investigation released by L'Archi in 2023 identified additional victims and revealed that Vanier had also been influenced by and had perpetuated some of the abusive theological framings used by a priest, Thomas Philippe, who had himself been disciplined by the Vatican decades earlier for similar conduct, suggesting a transmission of abusive spiritual manipulation techniques across generations of religious leaders. The case has prompted extensive reflection within the L'Archi organization and broader Catholic intellectual circles about how spiritual authority and a reputation for radical compassion toward marginalized populations could coexist with, and indeed potentially provide cover for, predatory behavior toward other vulnerable individuals, complicating the legacy of an organization that continues to do widely respected work while grappling publicly with the abusive history of its founder. Number 10. The Anglican Church Independent Inquiry. A National Reckoning in England and Wales. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse in England and Wales, a wide-ranging governmental inquiry established in 2014 to examine institutional failures across multiple sectors, dedicated a significant portion of its work to examining abuse within the Church of England and the Anglican Church more broadly, ultimately producing a report in 2020 that documented decades of failures by church leadership to adequately respond to abuse allegations against clergy members. The inquiry's findings detailed numerous individual cases of clergy abuse, including the case of Peter Ball, a former Bishop of Lewes and Bishop of Gloucester, who was eventually convicted in 2015 of offenses against 18 young men, having been cautioned rather than prosecuted decades earlier in 1993 after senior church figures, including correspondence later revealed to have involved the future King Charles III in a limited capacity as a concerned family friend of Ball's, had advocated for leniency rather than full accountability. The inquiry found that the Church of England's institutional culture had for decades prioritized the reputation of the Church and the careers of accused clergy over the welfare of victims, with the report specifically criticizing a pattern in which church leaders extended what the inquiry termed misplaced compassion toward accused clergy while failing to extend equivalent concern toward survivors. The inquiry's recommendations included calls for mandatory reporting requirements for suspected abuse, which had not previously existed as a legal requirement for clergy in England and Wales, and structural reforms intended to remove the handling of safeguarding concerns from the same church hierarchy whose career interests were potentially implicated in any given case. The report represented one of the most thorough governmental examinations of institutional religious abuse conducted by any national government, and its findings regarding the Church of England paralleled, in striking detail, the patterns of institutional protection and victim blaming that had been documented in Catholic Church investigations across multiple countries, reinforcing the conclusion that the dynamics of clergy abuse cover-up reflect broader institutional failures rather than being unique to any single denomination or religious tradition. Subscribe for more true crime cases.